Hello, my name is Siobhan Pearce and I'm the Education Officer at the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology. I would like to welcome you to this online lecture, Climate Change, What It Means for Our Built and Archaeological Heritage, with Jacqui Donnelly, Senior Architect, Built Heritage Policy, Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and Pauline Gleeson, Senior Archaeologist in the National Monument Service. This will be a closed YouTube live event, with this pre-recorded lecture and a live question and answer session at the end. So please note that the entire event will be recorded and posted online at a later stage. It is the first in a series of 4 talks that will explore climate change and archaeology, exploring how discoveries at archaeological sites and artifacts and the preservation of archaeological landscapes and built heritage will be impacted upon by climate change. The talks will be given by members of the Climate Change Advisory Group for Built and Archaeological Heritage and will be chaired by Nessa O'Connor, Assistant Keeper and Archaeologist of the Irish Antiquities Division of the National Museum of Ireland. And I'm now going to pass over to Nessa.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So, climate change is a major issue of concern for everyone, wherever they live or whatever their way of life may be. In the Heritage Services in Ireland, there's been a particular effort over the last few years to examine and assess our most vulnerable archaeological sites, built heritage and archaeological objects. Since 2018, a climate change advisory group drawn from a diverse range of groups, organisations and participants with a heritage background has met regularly to discuss and consider relevant case studies, surveys, and climate change related research. And all of this has had the purpose of trying to find the best way to address the inevitable effects of climate change on our heritage. A major outcome and achievement along the way was the publication of the Built and Archaeological Heritage Climate Change Adaptation Plan in 2019. And that publication has been under the lead authorship of one of the later speakers in this series, Dr. Jacqui Donnelly of the University of Lincoln. In this lecture series, we will hear more about the detailed work that has gone into that particular plan. And we will hear from those directly involved in dealing with heritage risk, survey, research, and really ensuring the availability of the most relevant knowledge and cutting-edge research. I can say, for instance, that here in the National Museum, we have really noticed an increase in the level of uncovering and discovery of new sites and new archaeological objects, together with our colleagues in the National Monument Service, with whom we work very closely. And those new discoveries and uncovering of unexpected sites has been largely as a result of extreme weather events. So now, it's my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jacqui Donnelly.
Hi.
Jacqui, that's Johnny there, or Jacqui there.
Hi, Nessa.
Saying hello. That's what we do on screen these days. So Jacqui is a senior architect in the Built Heritage section of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Jacqui has many years of experience in conservation architecture and policy, and she has spoken at many conferences, both in Ireland and internationally, on the impact of climate change on the built heritage. Jacqui has also been one of the key colleagues in preparing the plan that I was just speaking about and in progressing policy and action in relation to climate change. And our second speaker in today's presentation is Pauline Gleeson. Pauline,
hi, everyone.
Pauline waving at the screen. Pauline is in the same department and she's a senior archaeologist in the National Monuments Service. Likewise, she has many years of experience of monuments protection and care, and she deals very regularly with risk as a result of climate change and other factors as well. And I just want to say that here where I work, which is the Irish Antiquities Division of the National Museum, the archaeological section, we work very regularly with Pauline and her colleagues in the National Monument Service in relation to shared concerns about the archaeological heritage, both monuments and archaeological objects. So before I finish my short little piece in this event, just a couple of practical matters. So the presentation today is pre-recorded. That's the particular program that we're using. The two lectures together will take just under 40 minutes. And you will notice that you have a chat box on your screen. And at the end of the presentation, Jacqui's going to speak, or at least Jacqui's presentation will be presented first, then Pauline's. And at the end, or close to the end, you can put your questions into the chat box. So really, I think at this stage, I'd just like to invite you to sit back and enjoy the presentation. And Jacqui, as I say, will come up first. And of course, the title of the presentation is Climate Change and What It Means for Our Built and Archaeological Heritage. Thank you.
To talk to you all today. Climate change is one of the most significant and fastest growing threats to people and their cultural heritage throughout the world today. And Ireland is a small island on the edge of a large ocean, so we're very vulnerable to the many of the current and predicted climate changes. So this lecture series is a great opportunity to bring people's attention to the nature of the threat our heritage is facing and the action that needs to be taken to ensure the heritage is safeguarded for future generations. So we're talking about heritage and heritage sites in a wide sense, looking at World Heritage Sites, national monuments, earthen structures, masonry structures, underwater archaeology, buildings both protected and unprotected. We're looking at towns. We're looking at even pieces of infrastructure like railway stations and canals. And then we're also looking at other kinds of heritage that may be a bit more overlooked. We're talking about our vernacular heritage, our modern movement heritage from the 20th century. We're looking at street furniture like telephone kiosks or the water pump. We're looking at shops, buildings in streets. We're looking at bridges and industrial heritage. So apologies for the fuzziness of the text here. This is taken from our climate change sectoral adaptation plan for built and archaeological heritage. But it gives you an idea of the kind of both the observed impacts now and the projected climate impacts. And these are based on the International Panel on Climate Changes reports. But just to put them in more layman's language, what we're looking at in the future in Ireland are having hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, rising sea levels, and then the increased frequency and intensities of extreme weather events like storms, high winds, increased wind-driven rain, and more intense rainfall in the autumn and the winter, which will lead to the risk of more river flooding and rainwater flooding and ground saturation, and also prolonged dry spells. So what does this mean for actual heritage sites on a practical level? The hotter, drier summers could lead to soil shrinkage, which would affect structural stability of many structures. It can lead to the warping and splitting of things like timber paneling and other organic building elements. It can lead to pest infestation. We may be looking at new types of pests being introduced into Ireland that could damage our building fabric. There might be increased light damage to sensitive interior finishes and their contents. They might bring about an increased pressure to retrofit air conditioning units to historic buildings, which can be quite invasive. Risks of wildfires. We've seen what happened in Kerry in recent weeks with wildfires there. Changes to cultural landscapes. There may be certain types of plants that will no longer be able to grow, or there might be infestation of other types of species that will affect our cultural landscapes. But then on the plus side, there might be the discovery of new archaeological sites. And you can see an aerial photograph there of a site that came to light during the very dry spell in summer of 2018. Our warmer, wetter winters are going to lead to increased vegetation growth, and already longer growing seasons have been observed. And this can lead to a lot of growth on monuments and in buildings, such as ivy, as you can see here, which can actually overwhelm a monument and cause it to collapse. We're looking at saturation of building fabric that no longer has the time to dry out if the winters are that much wetter. We're looking at increased levels of relative humidity in our buildings, mold growth on the interior finishes and maybe on the contents too. And then when elements such as timber reach a certain moisture content, they become more vulnerable to insect attacks such as furniture beetle and fungal attack like dry rot. We might be looking at increased corrosion of metallic elements of the building. But then because of the reduction in freeze days, we might be looking at a beneficial reduction in the kind of freeze-thaw damage that we get when building fabric gets saturated by water. Increased intensity of storms will lead to erosion of coastal sites, structural and impact damage. For example, roof coverings been stripped off, which of course then exposes the interiors and the contents to damage. We might be looking at collapse of unstable masonry elements such as chimneys, or the collapse of entire ruins, for example. And this kind of saturation of the building fabric from wind-driven rain or wave action, as you can see in this very famous now photograph on the top there, taken from the Irish Examiner. And we might be looking at the loss of historic landscape features, such as trees, through wind throw. We're also sea level rise is happening and coastal erosion leading to coastal flooding, storm surge. This can undermine structures or the land adjacent to them, or entire structures can be lost due to coastal erosion. Buildings and sites become contaminated with salt water. Again, building fabric becoming saturated. Exposure and discovery of archaeological sites, but then also the submersion and erosion of other sites. Flooding, we particularly see this in our towns and cities, but also we might be looking at landslide, rockfall, softening or scouring of the ground under foundations, the decay and saturation of building fabric and elements, which will again corrode metals and mobilize salts in the building fabric. We could be looking at damage to bridges and other structures just from the force of the water going through them. Overflow of rainwater goods like gutters and drain pipes. And then, of course, a lot of floodwater is contaminated, which brings its own problems. So what are we doing about climate? What kind of climate action are we taking? And it's important to look at the two different aspects of climate action. There's climate change mitigation, which is reducing the level of greenhouse gases that we're emitting into the atmosphere and trying to stop or reverse climate change. And then there's climate change adaptation, which is admitting that there are changes already happening. They're locked in, and even if our greenhouse gas emissions were reduced to zero tomorrow, there are still impacts that will continue and evolve for the foreseeable future. So if we look first at climate change adaptation, there is a national adaptation framework, and it invited a number of sectors and leading government authorities and departments to produce climate change adaptation plans. So 9 plans make up the National Adaptation Framework. And as you can see, Built Archaeological Heritage is one of those. And our colleagues in National Parks and Wildlife Service had a biodiversity plan. So this is our climate change sectoral adaptation plan. It's, as I say, it's part of the National Adaptation Framework. It was prepared by the department by a multidisciplinary team led by Carrick Conservation. And Jacqui Donnelly, who's also speaking to you as part of this series, was the lead author. So the plan has 5 goals, 16 objectives, and then there are 48 actions in total. So one of the benefits of being part of the National Adaptation Framework was that we got to look at the plans of other sectors before they were published and look at the implications and the co-benefits. And similarly, they got to comment on ours and to make sure that it was all in order, there was nothing contradictory. And they're all intended to be living documents. So they're going to be reviewed on a regular basis with a full update every 3 to 5 years. So if I just talk you through some of the goals. Well, first of all, sorry to say that we have set up back in 2015, we set up a climate change advisory group of stakeholders to assist us in identifying what were the risks to our heritage and the vulnerabilities too. And they gave us input into the development of the adaptation plan. We've now gone on to establish a climate change planning team that's going to assist us in the implementation stage of the plan. So I've listed there a number of the stakeholders and other people who are helping us. And as you can see, it covers other government departments and agencies, local authority networks, professional institutes, academic institutes as well, and NGOs. So the first goal is to improve the understanding of the heritage resource and its vulnerability to climate change impacts. So the objectives under this are to establish a baseline for heritage resources from which we can measure change that is happening, conducting risk and vulnerability assessments for the kind of changes and impacts that there are on heritage, and then undertake monitoring of climate change and its impacts. And so under each of these objectives, there are several different actual actions that will need to take place. So goal 2 is to develop and mainstream sustainable policies and plans for climate change adaptation. So we're looking at integrating heritage issues into the relevant national, local, intersectoral policies and plans, to introduce climate change adaptation into sectoral policy and conservation planning at all levels across policymaking, and to try and increase and improve the disaster risk management of our built heritage. Goal 3 is to conserve Ireland's heritage for future generations. So increasing the resilience of heritage resources under different conditions, developing management and conservation approaches for the different environments that are emerging. And then there will be times when we realise that we cannot adapt a site to save it, and we will have to find ways of managing the loss, of finding ways to capture the value when that loss is inevitable. Goal 4 looks at communicating and transferring knowledge, so creating a vision for the heritage sector and giving leadership in response to climate change challenges, giving guidance and disseminating information, so trying to make sure that there's consistency of approach across the country, enabling the collection and the archiving and the sharing of data and experiences to do with heritage and climate change, and also developing training in climate change adaptation and in risk management. And then goal 5 is looking at trying to exploit opportunities for built and archaeological heritage and demonstrating its value and securing resources for its protection. So looking at different revenue streams and partnerships to resource the goals of our plan, building a better understanding of how the historic building stock and its adaptive reuse contributes to sustainable communities, maximising then the heritage potential as an engagement tool for cross-sectoral research and initiatives, because actually heritage has a lot to teach. It's very good at engaging people's attention and drawing attention to potential climate change effects. And then when we look at what we're doing for climate change mitigation, the government produced an all-government climate action plan in 2019. It's about to be a new iteration of it later this year, and it sets out the measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. And our share of that is to provide guidance on energy retrofitting measures for what we're calling traditionally built buildings, so historic buildings, and that's under Action 50 of the Climate Action Plan. But as well as that, we're promoting the sustainable reuse of the historic building stock. We're doing that through providing grant aid and tax incentives to the owners of these buildings to make sure they're kept in use, they're brought forward into the future and continue to be used. And I'd like to draw your attention to two publications from the department that are relative to this. In 2010, we brought out energy efficiency guidance for owners of buildings. So they set out the principles and the things people need to take into consideration if they're planning an energy retrofit. As I say, we are working on more detailed guidance at the moment for the professionals and for the installers of these energy efficiency measures. And then recently, just at the end of last year, we published Disaster, which is about disaster risk management in the historic built environment. So as you can see, it covers issues like fire as well, but it also deals with issues such as flood risk as well, which are very related to climate change. And really the emphasis is on prevention rather than cure, trying to get people to take preventive action before a disaster occurs, so mitigating its impact. But then also there's a lot of action happening on an international scale as well. Since its beginning, we've been involved with the Climate Heritage Network, which is seeking to mobilise the power of arts and culture and heritage in climate action. And they have an ambitious plan of a number of actions leading up to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November, which is a very major international climate change meeting that will be happening then. But also ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, has published guidance, Future for Our Pasts, Recently was launched the European Cultural Heritage Green Paper, which looks at how cultural heritage can feed into all the different actions and aspirations of the European Green Deal. And then also we've been dealing with our colleagues in the UK on a number of research projects. Cherish, which again you'll hear more about within this lecture series, is a project run jointly with Wales, and a recently completed project, Adapt Northern Heritage, which was led by our counterparts in Scotland. So now I'll hand over to Pauline, who's going to show you a number of case studies on the impacts of climate change, which have come to the attention of the National Monument Service.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Jacqui. And as Jacqui said, I'm just going to bring you through some case studies of severe weather impacts that we've seen in the National Monument Service. And just to start with, I'm going to share a slide on the reports of damage and threat to archaeological monuments since 2010. The green columns on the left are the overall reports of threat from a variety of activities, and the blue columns are specific to climate change related impacts such as erosion, collapse and so on. And you'll note in the middle that recorded for 2014 is the highest number of reports of threat and damage to monuments on record within this time frame, and the highest number of climate change related incidents in 2014, which is of course Storm Darwin. Them starting to talk about coastal erosion. This is the most frequently reported type of impact that we see in the National Monument Service reported to us by the public. And specifically, I'm going to start with impacts on ancient human remains and burial sites. Burial grounds. And the first slide I'm showing is in the west of Ireland in Connemara, and I'm not sure if my cursor is going to work here, but it's the centre of the site. So in the top right corner, you'll see the site that I'm talking about. It's a very small, discrete burial ground, which came to our attention in, was a recorded monument. It's protected under the National Monuments Act, but it first came to our attention in terms of severe weather impacts in 2014 in Storm Darwin, when ancient human remains were discovered here and reported by the Gardaí. And we've been monitoring this site since, and so as recently as 2020, and we've taken some drone footage and we'll continue to monitor this site. So it's an example of very vulnerable sites to coastal erosion burial grounds. This slide is a suite of images of how we encounter discoveries of ancient human remains, or how the public encounters and report it to the National Monument Service and the National Museum of Ireland. And so you can see in various different situations, all of these are from Storm Darwin and all from the west of Ireland. And they can either be from new sites that we didn't know about previously, didn't know there were burials there, not recorded, or sites that we'd known before and know that there are burials. And some are in situ, some are disarticulated. This slide is of an archaeological excavation undertaken by the National Museum of Ireland initially, and then completed by the National Monument Service by Stafford Blackland archaeological consultants. And this was following Stormophilia in 2017. And I include this image on the right because it's a really good image of what we see on the ground is in these very vulnerable contexts, the grass cover literally being peeled back by the waves and exposing what's beneath, leaving very prone to erosion and removal and wave action. And so it's quite a dramatic shot. This excavation revealed two burials previously unknown, totally previously unknown, which were dated to the 16th to 18th century, were probably burials of victims of drowning, which were unknown to the local community and were buried in non-consecrated ground. This slide is from the northwest, it's from Sligo, and the church to the left there is Stad Church, which itself has been exposed to coastal erosion for some time. The reason I've included this slide as well, though, is to show that the cobble beach here has been exposing peat layers repeatedly since 2015 and in 2017, and you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, the peat dried out to such an extent that it became quite risky for the buried archaeological remains. There were 20 stakes, wooden stakes here, which you can see an example of one of them. So we commissioned a small archaeological excavation of this material, which revealed Middle Bronze Age and Early Bronze Age dates for the material. This slide I've included because it shows the dramatic action at certain coastal locations, and this is on in County Clare. The image on the left in 2004, a very fragmentary church remains, only one wall, but we weren't aware there was burials here, and burials, ancient human remains were exposed and reported by the public back in 2014, Storm Darwin, and there continues to be reports, and the slide on the right shows when further ancient human remains and a Midden site were exposed and reported by the public, and we undertook commissioned archaeological excavation here with Dr. Linda Lynch. It's a very dynamic coastline, a very dynamic beach situation. I've chosen these two images, both from Storm Darwin, just to show you the dramatic impact post-storm surge at sites that are already at risk, that already have been beaten and battered, and just to show you the I suppose the extent of the damage that can occur and the undermining of foundations in addition to already unstable walls. I've included this example of a Midden. It's one of the most common sites to be reported to us by the public and quite visible when people are walking on beaches. And you can see again that grass mantle, that grass cover, that once that gets exposed, the site very quickly becomes eroded. And we've recorded these sites. It's one, I think there was about a third of the sites reported to us in Storm Darwin were of Midden type. I've included this image. It's again just to raise the issue about earthworks and their vulnerability to climate change impacts. And this is Glascarrig Martin Bailey in Wexford. And so I've also chosen it because it's on the east coast and very soft coastline, and it's been eroded by climate change impacts, weather erosion. And this particular monument is in private ownership and is also being studied by our colleagues in the Discovery Programme in their Cherish project, which I'm sure they'll be discussing and including in their discussions later in this lecture series. So the next suite of images I'm showing is relation to very dramatic storm impacts more inland. And the first example I'm showing you here is, and I've chosen this for a reason, it's a historic graveyard. And we had an enormous amount of reports of collapse at a historic graveyard in Storm Darwin, and we continue to have reports of collapse of graveyard boundary walls. And so this is a good example as to why. So the interior of the historic graveyard has built up over time with burials, and the exterior is at a much lower level. So these walls are in fact acting as retaining walls. So when you get extreme rainfall, the type that Jacqui's been talking about, storm conditions, lack of maintenance perhaps, vegetation encroachment, you get all of these issues together and you get a very saturated site. You can see such collapses, and sometimes it's exposed ancient human remains, but it can be very distressing for families who have relatives buried in historic graveyards, and they're quite difficult to deal with. They're challenging projects in terms of their repair. It's just a good example to show that, and it's a very common report and incident. I've included this example because it's an example of a collapse at a National Monument in State Care in the ownership of the Minister. And in this case, in the southwest corner, you can see an area of collapse. And this was after Storm Ciara in 2020. I've chosen these images because they're very stark images of catastrophic collapse at monuments. And we are unfortunately seeing cases like this. The one on the left is in County Meath after Storm Darwin. The one on the right, while it actually happened on a fine, still May day, it shows the dramatic impact. It is in 2018, and there had been a number of storms and extreme weather. And just on a fine day, it had a catastrophic collapse. And the reason I've chosen to include this image, again, both of these are in private ownership, but it's because it's in the middle of a working farmyard. And you can imagine how distressing it is for a farmyard, for a farmer to work in such a situation and to manage his animals and his work in that way. So again, very challenging. And in this case, we were able to, together with the local authority and colleagues in Built Heritage, able to support some studies and some immediate repairs here. I've included these images. They're dramatic looking images and they're National Monuments in State Care, just to illustrate the problem of trees and fallen and mature trees in proximity to archaeological monuments. This is Kilree. It's a national monument in the ownership of the minister, managed by the Office of Public Works. And the tree damage here is from last year as well. And I'll just show you further images. So on the left is on the exterior, on the gable wall of the church, and on the right is in the interior. And they're quite dramatic images of what can actually happen with tree falls. Happily, there wasn't as much damage as we anticipated, but it is a huge concern. It really shows the risk. These images, again, from a National Monument and State Care. This time, this is Stone Circle at Glebe, County Mayo, in the ownership, guardianship of the minister, and managed by the Office of Public Works. And miraculously, this branch hit across the monument, but seemed to weave around the orthostats, avoided the orthostats with minimal damage, and then there was quite serious damage on the estate fencing, as you can see. So it's just a dramatic shot of what can happen in a storm period. This is from 2020 as well, I think. I'm including one slide on inland flooding. Jacqui mentioned inland flooding to show you what we see in inland flooding. And this is an example from the River Ward in Swords. So back in 2000 was the first time this site, we had exposed ancient human remains at the site, which were excavated by the Underwater Archaeology Unit in the National Monument Service. And again, more recently in 2020, further exposure of ancient human remains at this site. So it's, I suppose, an example of what we see in terms of inland flooding and the impact on sites on river banks. So to underwater, our adaptation plan identifies underwater archaeological heritage as possibly one of the most at risk from severe weather impacts, severe storm surges. So just as background, the National Monuments, and I want to thank Connie Kelleher for a number of these slides, colleague in the Underwater Archaeological Unit. The National Monument Service Wreck Inventory of Ireland database has an ever-growing list of some 18,000 wrecks mapped to date. Of these, about 3,500 actual locations are displayed online in its Wreck Viewer. It's a very interesting site. We have the example here of the Sunbeam, which was beached on Ross Bay Strand in 1904, and it's what the underwater team called wrecking of a wreck. You can see the condition of the wreck in 2010. It was more buried in 2011, and in 2014 was very severely impacted by Storm Darwin, which moved the wreck 100 meters further up the beach. But it didn't stop there, and despite the best efforts of the underwater team and local authority, the wreck kept on being impacted by storms and is now 2 kilometers further from its original beached point. And there's an example of the remaining material here in the middle in 2018. This site was fully recorded. Every effort was made to try and keep it sandbanked so that we could rebury it, but that wasn't to be, and nature won out. I suppose it's an example of what Jacqui was trying to talk about as well in terms of management of loss. There are certain sites where we simply won't be able to preserve the site. There will be loss, and it's management of that loss. This is another site that the underwater team excavated in 2015, this time La Juliana, one of the Spanish Armada ships lost in Strida, County Sligo. And there's some very powerful images of the work of the unit. This image also shows the sea bronze cauldron was recovered, and I know that the underwater team would like me to acknowledge the relationship they have with the dive club and community there in Strida. These are more images of the bronze guns under conservation. So community, cultural heritage and climate change. We're very aware the vast majority of built and archaeological heritage is in private ownership. Around 140,000 monuments are recorded, of which about 1,000 are in state care. Communities and custodians therefore play a very important role in the protection of our archaeological heritage. And I'm going to show some examples here of some projects that we have been advising on. It's vital that we support our communities and custodians in this work. So the first example here is of a site in Donegal. And it's quite typical, I've chosen these images, it's quite typical, one of the most popular sites for communities to come together and to understand better the site and to carry out studies and to seek to have sites conserved are historic graveyards. And we can understand why. It's because it's a site where many people, relatives are buried, where they have a huge connection, where it gives them that sense of place and belonging and identity, and are hugely important to communities across the country, and even more so important in recent times. So the image on the right is of the parish church, and when it was covered in vegetation, and we have since supported conservation programme there following a conservation plan funded by the Heritage Council. There was removal of vegetation and consolidation and stabilisation of the remains. And one of the reasons, quite apart from its in its own right, but one of the reasons was to protect this cross. It's a very important cross, St. Mura's cross, an early cross, 7th century, and very highly decorated and very, very cherished by this community. And I've chosen this image because to raise the issue of our carved stone monuments, which again are very exposed to the impacts of severe weather and extreme weather impacts. And this is a very challenging area as well. So really to include it here, this particular suite of monuments, and of which there are many in state care and in private ownership and in public authority ownership, are particularly vulnerable and need to be studied, and conservation plans are prepared for their care and protection. This next image is of the deserted medieval settlement in Rindoon in Roscommon, and I've included this image because this was a project underway by community since 2008, and a team of expert conservation architect and archaeologist. And even in the middle of that conservation programme, the remains were so fragile that there was quite a serious collapse at the gatehouse just immediately before conservation. And I've included it here just to illustrate just how fragile these remains are, just how exposed and vulnerable they are. And luckily enough in this case, because of the recording and the techniques and the best practice approach that was applied in this project, the gatehouse could be rebuilt, preserving its integrity and its authenticity, because we had all that record, and we had skilled trades, or the conservation team had skilled tradespeople on board and skilled conservation architects, and so the best possible approaches were taken here. I've included this image because it's so consistent with what we're seeing on the ground. So this is a castle in County Sligo in private ownership, Moigara Castle. And it's quite typical of the kind of cases that we come across in our daily work. So vulnerable, with communities and landowners asking us for direction and seeking advice. They don't want the catastrophic collapses that we've seen in earlier slides. And it's these communities and these custodians that we really need to help and support. So building resilience, this is a very important part of our adaptation planning to provide supports in terms of building resilience in the monuments, but also building resilience in our communities. So this image is of a suite of images of works undertaken last year on foot of the Community Monuments Fund, and we're about to embark on another 2021 Community Monuments Fund with a budget of 2 million. We also have the Historic Structures Fund, and the Built Heritage Investment Scheme is run by the department. All three together with the local authorities, and we're building very good relationships with local authorities with these projects, and seeing in fantastic projects coming to bear. So to new discoveries, and Jacqui will have mentioned this about where climate change can actually trigger new discoveries. So some of what we're seeing are like these examples here, which are all intertidal Poststorm and troughs of Poststorm. And the one on the left is from Creedon, Fornox Strand in 2016, funded and excavated by the National Biodiversity Service. Juliana Dunn was the archaeologist there. And on the right, the two images are of an intertidal Poststorm excavated by our own underwater archaeology team in 2014 after Storm Darwin. So the dry weather conditions of 2018 brought numerous reports of new discoveries, crop marks from aerial photography. You can see in this image that this is one of the most spectacular reports of 2018. It is, of course, of the ceremonial landscape of Brúna Báine World Heritage Site. And you can see a very bleached new Grange there to the left of the image. And so very many new discoveries which received worldwide attention. There's actually a dedicated installation at the Bruno Boigna exhibit in Meath, dedicated to these new discoveries. And we also have an interim report available on our website. So this is one of my last images, and it's fitting that I close on discovery of 930 lithics at a site. And what happened here in Sligo was with the retreat of the lake waters, an area became exposed with lithic scatter, and a local archaeologist identified the site and reported to the National Museum and the National Monument Service, and we commissioned a gridded survey of the site, and ultimately 930 lithics were recorded and recovered, and you can see the delight of the children here who were involved. So this remains for me to thank everybody on behalf of Jacqui and myself, to thank the National Museum for the invitation to speak here today. Here are our websites, which people may already know, and there's also a link to the Built Archaeological Sectoral Adaptation Plan. In terms of reports of threat or damage or discovery of new archaeological sites, we'd advise you to contact the National Monuments email at housing.gov.ie, and also, of course, in terms of our colleagues, reports of discovery of archaeological objects to the Director of the National Museum of Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Jacqui and Pauline for their excellent presentation. I'm sure you'll all agree that they really covered a multitude and such a diversity of different sites that are affected by climate change. Jacqui's presentation really set the scene for us. We saw so many different types of monuments, and we also got a sense of the action being taken in terms of archaeological and built heritage in the context of government policy and the climate action bill and climate action plan that are being taken forward at the moment by government as well. And then we had the detail from Pauline of so many case studies, very dramatic images as well, coastal erosion, and I suppose it's in the nature of climate change effect that the sites and Portsmouth heritage that's affected tend to be in quite dramatic locations. So it was great to see, and I just mentioned as well that a lot of the sites that Pauline highlighted are very recent. So it's very recent knowledge and archaeological information. Siobhan, would you like to say something about the rest of the lecture series? And in doing that, I once again really very much thank Pauline and Jacqui. There's just so much in the presentation that you've given today. I think that we'll need to go back and have a look at it again, probably, to absorb all the information. And
well, thanks very much.
It's a
Thank
perfect.
you very much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you both. And it's been a perfect introduction, I think, to the rest of the series, because it's set the scene and set the stage of the totality, I suppose, of the issue. And then we'll get some detailed information from the other lectures.
We will indeed, Nessa, and thank you, Nessa, for hosting today, and also to Jacqui and Pauline. And it's great that we were kicking off this lecture series during Biodiversity Week, so that was really very appropriate, I think. The lectures will be posted online. The next one up actually is by Dr. Jacqui Donnelly, who has been mentioned several times. Of course, she's been involved in the development of the plan. And she's going to be speaking on Tuesday, the 22nd of June, Can the Past Adapt to an Uncertain Future? And Jacqui is going to provide an overview really of the impacts of climate change on cultural heritage in a more international way around the world, but also some examples here in Ireland, and discuss what's been done abroad to answer those challenges. So that will be on Tuesday, the 22nd of June. If you're on the museum's newsletter, if you've signed up to that, you'll see the Eventbrite posting going out about that. We'll be putting that up. The lecture after that will be on Tuesday, the 20th of July, and that's going to look specifically at the County Kerry sites and the effects of climate change on national monument sites in County Kerry. And that's going to be with Fergus McCormick, who is a senior architect with the OPW. The last lecture will be during Heritage Week. It'll be all the way in August. So it's one a month we're really looking at for this series. And it's going to be about another project that was mentioned very much during Jacqui and Pauline's lecture, and that was the Cherish project. And that's going to be understanding climate change impacts on our coastal cultural heritage. And that'll be by Sandra Henry, who's the research archaeologist for the Cherish project and with the Discovery programme. So as I said, if you sign up to the museum newsletter, you'll see all the postings and reminders about those. And I'd like to thank everybody again for their contributions today. So thank you.